The wind that night did not sound like freedom. It sounded like fear. It slipped through the cracks of wooden homes, brushed against oil lamps struggling to stay alive, and carried with it the smell of damp earth and uncertainty. Somewhere in the darkness of a small colonial town, a baby cried, unaware that the land beneath him would one day be called the United States of America. But on this night, there was no America. There were only colonies, and above them all, an empire. Long before stars and stripes, before declarations and constitutions, before liberty became a promise whispered into every child's ear, this land was something else entirely. It was raw, unnamed, unclaimed by ideas, though fiercely claimed by people who had lived here long before any European sail appeared on the horizon. The story of the United States does not begin with freedom. It begins with survival. Thousands of years before the first English word was spoken on this soil, the land breathed with life of its own. Vast forests stretched endlessly. Rivers ran unchained, carving paths through valleys untouched by iron tools. From the frozen reaches of the north to the sunburned deserts of the southwest, indigenous nations thrived, not as one people, but as hundreds of civilizations, each with its own language, laws, and understanding of the world. They did not call this land new. It was ancient to them. The Haudenosaunee governed through councils and balance. The Mississippian cultures raised cities with earthen mounds that rivaled European towns in size. Along the Pacific coast, societies built wealth through trade, craftsmanship, and tradition. This continent was not empty, it was alive. Then, in the late 15th century, the horizon changed. The ocean, once a boundary, became a road. When European ships arrived, they carried more than explorers and flags. They carried ambition sharpened by hunger, faith tangled with power, and diseases that would move faster than any army. Spain came first, chasing gold and glory. France followed, trading and settling cautiously. And England, patient, stubborn England, came not to conquer quickly, but to stay. The English did not arrive as masters, they arrived as strangers. In 1607, on the marshy banks of the James River, a fragile settlement took root, Jamestown. It was less a beginning than a gamble. The men who arrived were not farmers or builders. Many were gentlemen who believed wealth would rise from the soil simply because they wished it to. It did not. Hunger arrived before prosperity, so did disease. Winters were merciless, leadership uncertain, and survival never guaranteed. At one point, desperation drove settlers to acts so dark they would be whispered about for generations. Jamestown did not succeed because it was destined to. It survived because failure refused to finish it. And survival in America's earliest chapters was often bought at an unbearable cost, paid by native peoples pushed aside, deceived, or destroyed. Further north, in 1620, another group arrived, different in purpose, but no less desperate. They called themselves Pilgrims. They were not seeking gold, they were fleeing persecution, chasing the right to worship as they believed God intended. Their ship, the Mayflower, carried families into the unknown, guided more by faith than maps. When they landed, winter was already waiting. Cold wrapped itself around them like a sentence. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly. Nearly half of them died before spring. They might have vanished into history, another failed experiment, if not for the people who were already there, the Wampanoag. With guidance from native allies, the settlers learned how to plant, hunt, and survive. Out of this fragile cooperation came a moment, later mythologized as harmony, a harvest feast remembered as Thanksgiving. But history is rarely as gentle as memory. The alliance was temporary. As English settlements grew, so did their hunger for land, control, and dominance. What began as coexistence slowly turned into displacement, conflict, and war. America was not born innocent. It was shaped by collision. By the mid-1600s, the colonies were no longer experiments. They were systems. Tobacco transformed Virginia, sugar and trade reshaped the Caribbean, and in 1619 a ship arrived carrying something that would stain the nation's soul long before it existed: enslaved Africans. They were not the first unfree people in the colonies, but they would become the foundation of a brutal economic engine. Race, once a fluid concept, hardened into law. Human beings were reduced to property. Generations would be born into chains, while others built wealth on their stolen lives. Freedom in early America was selective. And yet, even in chains, resistance lived. Songs carried memory, stories preserved identity, small acts of defiance whispered a truth that one day would shake the nation, that liberty could not be owned by one people alone. As the colonies expanded, so did their contradictions. They spoke of rights while denying them. They prayed for salvation while enforcing suffering. They saw themselves as Englishmen, yet lived oceans away from English reality. Over time, distance bred difference. The colonies developed their own economies, assemblies, and attitudes. They argued, disagreed, and governed themselves more than the crown ever intended. And while London saw them as assets, the colonists increasingly saw themselves as something else, not independent, but no longer obedient. Still, loyalty to the king remained until it became expensive. After costly wars fought on colonial soil, Britain turned to taxation. Paper, tea, stamps, small things meant to raise revenue, but to the colonists they symbolized something larger: power without representation. It wasn't the money that angered them, it was the message: you exist to serve us. And in taverns, churches, and town halls, a dangerous idea began to spread, quiet at first, then louder. What if they didn't? This idea did not yet have a name, but it had a voice. Pamphlets circulated, arguments sharpened. Men who had once called themselves British subjects began calling themselves something else: Americans. Not a nation, not yet. Just a feeling, a belief that people could govern themselves, that authority did not flow downward from a crown, but upward from the governed, that freedom was not a gift, but a right. These ideas were radical, dangerous, treasonous, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. The empire felt the tension tighten, the colonies felt the ground shift beneath their feet. History was leaning forward, and somewhere in the flicker of a candle, a man picked up a pen, unaware that the words he would soon write would ignite a revolution that would change the world. The first shots of the American Revolution were not fired in anger. They were fired in confusion. A cold mist hung over the fields of Lexington in April 1775, clinging to the grass like a warning no one could read clearly. Farmers stood holding muskets meant for hunting, not war. Across from them, British soldiers, trained, uniformed, disciplined, waited for orders they barely understood themselves. No one knew who pulled the trigger, but when the smoke cleared, history had crossed a line it could never step back from. Years before that morning, the revolution had already begun, not on battlefields, but in words. It began in arguments shouted across tavern tables, in sermons delivered from wooden pulpits, and in ink-stained pamphlets passed from hand to hand. The most powerful weapon in early America was not the musket, it was the idea. Taxation without representation. The phrase spread like fire through dry timber. To the British government, it was a practical necessity. To the colonists, it was an insult layered atop a growing sense of betrayal. They had fought alongside Britain in wars, they had expanded British wealth, and now they were being asked to pay without a voice. The Stamp Act struck first. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, every piece of paper carried the mark of imperial authority. Protest erupted almost immediately. Effigies were burned, officials were threatened, mobs formed where none had existed before, and something new emerged from the chaos: unity. For the first time, colonies that had once distrusted one another began to see themselves as connected. Resistance in Boston inspired anger in Virginia. Outrage in New York echoed in Pennsylvania. The idea of shared destiny slowly took shape. Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but it did not retreat. Instead, it doubled down. Boston became the center of gravity. British soldiers occupied the city, their red coats a constant reminder of distant authority enforced at gunpoint. Tensions escalated with every passing month. Insults turned into shoves, shoves turned into violence. On a cold March night in 1770, a crowd gathered. Snowballs flew, insults cut deeper. A soldier fell, another panicked. Shots rang out. When the smoke lifted, 5 colonists lay dead. Blood soaked into the snow. The event would be remembered as the Boston Massacre, not because of its scale, but because of its symbolism. Propaganda transformed tragedy into fuel. Engravings spread across the colonies, depicting ruthless soldiers slaughtering innocent civilians. The truth was messier, but truth mattered less than meaning, and the meaning was clear: British power was dangerous. Resistance hardened into organization. Committees of correspondence linked colonies through letters and shared outrage. Boycotts strangled British goods. Women, often erased from formal history, became central to the resistance, organizing homespun cloth production and enforcing non-importation agreements. Then came tea. In 1773, Britain attempted compromise through the Tea Act: cheap tea, reduced taxes, profit preserved. But the colonists saw through it. Cheap tea was not a gift, it was a trap. On a December night, men disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor. Crates were smashed open, tea poured into the dark water like a sacrifice. The Boston Tea Party was not random destruction, it was deliberate defiance. Britain responded with fury. Ports were closed, self-government was crushed, soldiers returned in greater numbers. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by colonists, were meant to break resistance. Instead, they united it. Across the colonies, fear gave way to preparation. Militias drilled, weapons were stockpiled, meetings turned secretive. The question was no longer if conflict would come, but when. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial weapons. They never expected resistance. They found it. At Lexington, the stand was brief and chaotic. At Concord, it was organized and deadly. Colonial militias melted into the landscape, firing behind trees, stone walls, and homes. The British retreat became a running gauntlet. By the time the soldiers reached Boston, the war had begun. The colonies were no longer protesting, they were fighting. Yet unity remained fragile. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown. Others feared the cost of rebellion. Some profited from British rule and resisted change. This was not a unanimous revolution. It was a civil conflict. Into this uncertainty stepped voices that would define the era. One of them was Thomas Paine. In early 1776, his pamphlet Common Sense exploded across the colonies.
Written in plain language, it cut through hesitation like a blade. Paine did not argue for reform, he argued for independence, complete, irreversible, and necessary. Monarchy, he claimed, was absurd. An island should not rule a continent. A king was not chosen by God, but by chance of birth. The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It did what years of debate could not. It made independence inevitable. Still, words alone could not defeat an empire. The Continental Army, ragged, undertrained, underfunded, formed under the command of a man uniquely suited to impossible tasks, Washington. Washington was not the best general of his time. He lost battles, he retreated often, but he possessed something more important: patience, resolve, and an understanding of what the war truly was. This was not about winning every fight. It was about surviving long enough to make Britain give up. The early months were brutal. Supplies were scarce, discipline was fragile, morale wavered, soldiers deserted. Yet Washington held the army together through force of will and personal sacrifice. He refused a salary. He shared hardship. He became the symbol of endurance. By the summer of 1776, the moment could no longer be delayed. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Debate raged behind closed doors. Independence was not a poetic ideal. It was a death sentence if failed. But hesitation faded beneath conviction. On July 4, 1776, words were put to paper that would echo across centuries. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted, it did not magically create a nation, it created a commitment, one paid in blood. We mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It was not rhetoric, it was a warning. Because from that moment forward, there would be no compromise, only victory or ruin. As bells rang and crowds celebrated, British fleets gathered, armies mobilized, the most powerful empire on earth prepared to crush a rebellion it now recognized as treason. The war was only beginning, and the hardest days, the ones that would test the very idea of liberty, were still ahead.
Independence had been declared, but independence had not been won. In the months that followed July 1776, celebration faded quickly into terror. British warships crowded American harbors like steel shadows. Tens of thousands of trained soldiers crossed the Atlantic, backed by mercenaries, cannons, and the confidence of an empire that had crushed rebellions before. The Continental Army was not ready. New York fell first. Washington tried to hold the city, but the British struck with precision. They outmaneuvered him on Long Island, forcing a retreat that nearly destroyed the revolutionary cause before it could mature. Only a daring nighttime evacuation, boats gliding silently across the East River, saved the army from capture. It was not a victory, it was survival. And survival became the pattern. The winter that followed was merciless. Desertion spread, supplies vanished, soldiers marched barefoot, leaving trails of blood in the snow. Letters home spoke of hunger, sickness, and doubt. Many wondered whether independence had been a terrible mistake. Washington knew something the British did not. This war would not be won by holding cities. It would be won by refusing to die. On Christmas night, 1776, when hope was nearly extinguished, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River. Wind howled, ice battered the boats, men slipped and fell, exhausted and frozen. At dawn, they struck Trenton. The victory was small in military terms, but enormous in spirit. It proved the army still had teeth. It proved the rebellion still breathed, and it reminded the world that the colonists would not surrender quietly. But morale could only be carried so far. By 1777, the British adjusted their strategy. They aimed to cut the colonies in half by controlling the Hudson River. If successful, New England, the heart of rebellion, would be isolated. The plan nearly worked. British General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, confident and well-equipped. But confidence slowed him. Dense forests, stretched supply lines, and relentless colonial resistance drained his strength. At Saratoga, the impossible happened. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and outlasted, Burgoyne surrendered. It was more than a battlefield victory, it was a turning point. France, long eager to weaken Britain, now believed the Americans could actually win. Money, weapons, and soldiers followed. So did hope. The rebellion was no longer alone. Yet, even with allies, the cost was crushing. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge became the crucible of the American spirit. 12,000 men arrived. Thousands would not leave. Hunger hollowed their faces. Disease filled mass graves. Some froze in their tents. Others broke under the strain and deserted. Washington stayed. He walked among the men. He listened. He endured what they endured. And under the discipline of Baron von Steuben, the army transformed. Training replaced chaos. Order replaced despair. Valley Forge did not defeat the British, it defeated hopelessness. The army that emerged was no longer a desperate militia, it was a force. The war shifted south. Britain sought to exploit loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. At first it worked. Cities fell, rebels scattered. The conflict became uglier, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Atrocities mounted. Mercy vanished. But the South did not submit easily. Guerrilla warfare bled British forces dry. Leaders like Nathaniel Greene avoided direct confrontation, trading land for time, striking supply lines, and forcing the enemy to chase shadows. The British won battles and lost the war of endurance. Everything narrowed to one place, Yorktown. In 1781, British General Cornwallis fortified his position, expecting evacuation by the Royal Navy. But the French fleet arrived first, sealing the Chesapeake Bay. Washington and French forces moved in from the land, trapped. For weeks, artillery thundered, trenches crept closer, hope drained away. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. When the news spread, celebrations erupted, but Washington remained cautious. He knew better than to mistake one moment for final victory. Still, the war was effectively over. An empire had been humbled. A rebellion had survived. Peace came slowly. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized American independence. British troops departed. Loyalists fled or adapted. The land exhaled after years of violence. But freedom, once gained, demanded definition. The colonies were now states. The rebellion was now a nation. And the hardest question of all lay ahead. What would this new America become?
Victory did not bring peace of mind. It brought uncertainty. The war was over. But the question that haunted the former colonies was far more dangerous than British cannons ever had been. How to govern themselves without destroying what they had just fought to create. They had defeated a king. Now they had to resist becoming one. The first attempt at unity was weak by design. The Articles of Confederation reflected fear more than confidence. Power rested with the states. The national government could not tax, could not enforce laws, could not even guarantee unity. It was a league, not a nation. At first, it felt safe, but safety bred instability. War deaths piled up. Soldiers went unpaid. Foreign powers watched closely, sensing weakness.
Trade collapsed into chaos as states taxed one another like rivals instead of partners. Then came Shays' Rebellion. In Massachusetts, farmers, many of them veterans, rose up against courts that threatened to seize their land over unpaid debts. They were not enemies of the Republic. They were its children, abandoned. The rebellion was small. Its message was enormous. Liberty without order was not freedom. It was collapse. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, officially to revise the Articles. Unofficially, they knew the truth. They were there to start over. The doors were shut, windows closed, secrecy enforced. What emerged from that room would shape centuries. The Constitution was born not from idealism, but from compromise and fear. Fear of tyranny, fear of chaos, fear of human nature itself. Power was divided, checked, balanced. No king, no mob rule, just an uneasy trust in institutions. Slavery, the nation's greatest contradiction, was postponed rather than resolved, counted, protected, and hidden behind carefully chosen language. The cost of unity was moral compromise. Some walked away uneasy, others angry, but enough stayed. Ratification was a battle of words. Federalists argued that a strong central government was necessary for survival. Anti-Federalists warned it would crush individual liberty. Newspapers burned with debate, pamphlets flooded the streets. To win support, promises were made. The Bill of Rights, 10 amendments guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, and protection from government abuse, became the shield the people demanded. Liberty was written into law, but law alone could not guarantee it. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. He did not seek the role, he feared it, and that fear made him the right choice. Washington understood the danger of precedent. Every action would define the office. He spoke carefully, acted deliberately, and when his time came, he stepped away, proving that power in America would be temporary. It was an act as revolutionary as any battlefield victory. But unity was fragile. Political factions formed almost immediately. Alexander Hamilton envisioned a strong financial system, national debt, and industrial growth. Thomas Jefferson feared centralized power and championed agrarian independence. They were both patriots, and they despised each other. The divide they created would echo through centuries of American politics. As the nation stabilized, it expanded. Treaties were signed, lands surveyed. Indigenous nations were pushed further west through negotiation, coercion, and force. Expansion was framed as destiny, but destiny had victims. Freedom grew for some, it vanished for others. When Washington left office, the Republic held. Barely. It had survived its first test, but storms gathered on the horizon. Foreign conflict, internal division, and a question that would not stay buried forever. Slavery. The dream of liberty was unfinished, and history was not done asking its price.
The Republic was still young when it began to stretch. At first, expansion felt like promise. Land meant opportunity. Distance meant freedom. The frontier became a canvas on which Americans projected their hopes, wealth, independence, reinvention. But every mile westward carried a shadow. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation overnight. It was bold, risky, possibly unconstitutional, and absolutely transformative. Thomas Jefferson hesitated, knowing he had overstepped his own beliefs about limited government. But the future demanded decisiveness. With one signature, the United States became a continental power. Explorers followed.
Lewis and Clark traced rivers into the unknown, guided by indigenous knowledge and the quiet strength of Sacagawea. Maps filled in, trade expanded, settlers followed, and with them came conflict. Indigenous nations were not passive obstacles. They resisted, adapted, negotiated, and fought. Leaders like Tecumseh envisioned unity against American expansion. Others sought survival through accommodation. None could stop the tide. Treaties were broken, lands were seized, removal became policy. In the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson, the Trail of Tears forced tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes. Thousands died along the way. Expansion built America. It also broke lives. Meanwhile, the economy transformed. Factories rose in the North, cotton ruled the South, and slavery, already embedded, became more profitable, more brutal, more entrenched. Every new territory reignited the same question: free or slave? Compromises delayed the inevitable. Lines were drawn on maps, laws were passed and repealed. Violence erupted in places like Bleeding, Kansas, where ideology spilled into bloodshed. The nation was splitting along moral and economic fault lines. Voices rose against slavery. Abolitionists were mocked, threatened, attacked. Newspapers were burned, speakers silenced. But the movement grew. Formerly enslaved people spoke truths the nation could not ignore. Frederick Douglass, with words sharpened by experience, exposed the hypocrisy of a country founded on liberty. Others turned to action. In 1859, John Brown attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to ignite a slave rebellion. He failed. He was executed. But his death terrified the South and inspired the North. The center could no longer hold. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. He promised to preserve the Union, not immediately to end slavery. But for the South, his election was enough. States began to secede. The Union cracked. Then, at Fort Sumter, cannons fired. The Civil War began. It would be the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Fields became graves. Ideals were tested beyond rhetoric. Lincoln struggled under impossible pressure. He mourned the dead while redefining the war's purpose. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the conflict, not just as a fight to preserve the Union, but to end slavery. Freedom became a weapon and a promise. The war raged on. Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, names etched into memory with blood. Soldiers wrote letters home knowing many would never return. When victory finally came in 1865, the cost was staggering: over 600,000 dead. The Union preserved, slavery abolished, but peace would not come easily.
The war ended with silence. Cannons stopped firing. Armies disbanded. Men returned home, those who could. Cities lay scarred. Farms were ruined. Graveyards multiplied faster than memories could heal. And then, just days after victory, the nation lost its leader. Abraham Lincoln was shot in a theater, his life extinguished at the very moment the Union he fought to save stood whole again. The shock rippled through the country like a second war, quiet, devastating, and deeply personal. Lincoln had spoken of healing, of malice toward none, of binding up the nation's wounds. Without him, Reconstruction became something far more fragile and far more contested. 4 million formerly enslaved people were free. But freedom in law did not mean safety in life. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th promised citizenship and equal protection. The 15th sought to protect the right to vote. On paper, the revolution was complete.
In reality, the backlash was swift. The South lay in ruins, economically and socially. Former Confederates resented defeat. Many refused to accept black equality. Laws known as black codes attempted to control labor, movement, and opportunity, slavery by another name. Violence followed. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, enforcing white supremacy through terror. Night rides, lynchings, burned schools and churches. Fear became policy where law could not reach. The federal government intervened, briefly. Troops occupied southern states. Black men voted, held office, shaped governments. For a moment, the promise of Reconstruction felt real. And then, the nation grew tired. Political compromise ended federal enforcement. Troops withdrew. Power returned to those who had never accepted defeat. Segregation hardened into law. Jim Crow rose where Reconstruction fell. Voting rights vanished behind literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation. Separate became unequal. Justice bent under pressure. The nation moved forward without carrying everyone with it. Freedom had been declared. Equality was postponed. Again. As the South rebuilt under restriction, the North transformed through industry. Factories multiplied, cities exploded in size. Immigrants arrived by the millions, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, chasing opportunity in smoke-filled streets and crowded tenements. America was becoming a machine. Wealth accumulated rapidly, for some. Labor was cheap, dangerous, and replaceable. Children worked. Unions formed. Strikes erupted. Soldiers were sometimes called in not to defend workers, but to break them. Progress had a price, and someone always paid it. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. It was no longer a fragile republic clinging to survival. It was an emerging power, economically, militarily, culturally. But its contradictions remained. Democracy without equality, opportunity without fairness, freedom shadowed by exclusion. The nation had grown larger, richer, stronger, but it had not yet grown whole.
For most of its early life, the United States looked inward. Oceans protected it. Distance defined it. The wounds of civil war was still fresh, and the idea of foreign entanglements felt dangerous. Presidents warned against alliances. The nation focused on growth, not dominance. But history does not allow stillness. By the end of the 19th century, America had changed. Its factories overflowed with goods. Its cities hummed with industry. Its population surged. And its leaders began to ask a question that had once belonged only to empires. What role should America play in the world? The answer arrived with a war few expected to change anything. In 1898, the Spanish-American War erupted over Cuba. It was brief, decisive, and transformative. Spain's aging empire collapsed almost overnight. The United States emerged with territories thousands of miles from its shores: Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. The Republic now held colonies. Some celebrated. Others warned that America was betraying its own ideals. Was empire compatible with liberty? Could a nation born in rebellion rule others without consent? There was no clear answer, only momentum. The Philippines resisted American rule. A brutal counterinsurgency followed, one largely erased from public memory. The language of liberation clashed with the reality of occupation. America had crossed a threshold. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States tried to remain neutral,
but neutrality eroded under submarine attacks, economic ties, and a belief, however fragile, that American involvement could shape a better peace. In 1917, America entered the war. Millions were mobilized, industry shifted overnight, young men crossed the Atlantic into trench warfare that defied comprehension. The war ended swiftly after America's arrival, but the cost was immense. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of making the world safe for democracy. The peace that followed failed to do so. The seeds of another war were planted in the treaties that ended the first. Back home, the 1920s roared. Jazz filled the air. Stock markets soared. Cars rolled off assembly lines. Advertising sold dreams as easily as products. But prosperity was uneven and fragile. In 1929, the market collapsed. The Great Depression followed, hollowing out banks, farms, and families. Bread lines stretched through cities. Dust storms swallowed the plains. Faith in the system crumbled. The nation waited for leadership. Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered it. The New Deal reshaped the relationship between government and citizens. Programs provided jobs, relief, and hope. Critics warned of overreach. Supporters saw salvation. The role of government expanded and never fully retreated. Then the world caught fire again. World War II pulled America fully onto the global stage. Pearl Harbor shattered isolation. Factories transformed into arsenals. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Entire communities were uprooted. Japanese Americans imprisoned in camps, victims of fear disguised as security. The war was total. And when it ended, America stood unmatched. It had lost hundreds of thousands, but far fewer than others. Its cities stood intact, its economy surged, its military spanned the globe. The United States was no longer just a nation. It was a superpower.
Victory in World War II brought relief, not rest. The ruins of Europe smoked, Asia reeled, and between the former allies of the war, suspicion hardened into something colder, more dangerous. Two visions faced each other across the world. One promised freedom through democracy and markets. The other promised equality through control and revolution. The Cold War began without a declaration, without a battlefield, yet with consequences that would shape every corner of American life. Fear became policy. Nuclear weapons replaced armies as symbols of power. Cities practiced air raid drills. Children learned to hide beneath desks as if wood could stop fire from the sky. Mutually assured destruction became the logic of survival. And at home, paranoia thrived. Communism was no longer just a foreign ideology. It was a suspected infection within. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to prominence by accusing Americans of disloyalty without evidence. Careers were destroyed, lives were upended, fear silenced dissent. In trying to protect freedom, the nation restricted it. Again. Yet even as America confronted enemies abroad, a deeper conflict burned within. The promise of equality had never been fully honored. Segregation defined daily life in much of the country. Voting rights were suppressed. Opportunity was limited by skin color. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality became impossible to ignore, especially as the nation claimed leadership of the free world. Change demanded courage. The civil rights movement rose not through violence, but through moral clarity. Ordinary people marched, sat, refused to move, faced dogs, fire hoses, jail cells, and worse. Leaders emerged. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of dreams that sounded radical only because they should have been ordinary. Others, like Malcolm X, challenged the nation with anger sharpened by injustice. Progress came slowly.
resisted fiercely, but laws changed. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act marked victories carved from sacrifice. Legal segregation ended. Political participation expanded. The soul of America shifted, unevenly, incompletely, but undeniably. Meanwhile, the Cold War turned hot in distant lands. In Korea, then Vietnam, American soldiers fought wars defined not by territory, but by ideology. Vietnam, in particular, fractured the nation. Television brought brutality into living rooms. Trust in government eroded as truth and propaganda collided. Protests filled streets. Generations clashed. Faith in institutions cracked. America began questioning itself in public. By the 1970s, exhaustion set in. Watergate shattered confidence in leadership. Presidents resigned. Cynicism replaced certainty. Yet the system held. Power transferred peacefully. Institutions bent but did not break. As the Cold War waned, the United States stood changed, stronger in some ways, wiser in others, still struggling to align its ideals with reality. The world it had helped shape was entering a new, uncertain phase, and America would once again be tested.
When the Cold War ended, there was no victory parade. The Soviet Union collapsed quietly, not with a final battle, but with exhaustion. The ideological enemy that had shaped American policy for nearly half a century simply disappeared. For a brief moment, it seemed as though history itself had paused. America stood alone, the sole superpower, unchallenged, uncertain what that truly meant. The 1990s felt like a breath between storms. Technology surged forward. The internet connected lives across continents. Markets globalized. Borders softened, economically, if not politically. Democracy spread unevenly, celebrated loudly, questioned quietly. Many believed conflict on the scale of the past was over. They were wrong. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the illusion shattered. Skyscrapers fell. Smoke swallowed the sky. Thousands died in hours. The nation watched in disbelief as vulnerability replaced confidence. America was at war again, but this time the enemy had no uniform, no capital, no clear end. Fear returned. So did unity. For a while. The war on terror reshaped American life. Surveillance expanded. Wars stretched across Afghanistan and Iraq. Lives were lost far from home, while debates raged at home about security, liberty, and truth. Some sacrifices were necessary. Others remained contested. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. The economy soared, then collapsed again. In 2008, financial systems imploded. Homes were lost. Jobs vanished. Inequality deepened. The promise of opportunity felt increasingly fragile for millions. Anger simmered, and anger seeks expression. Social movements rose against racism, against inequality, against silence. Technology amplified voices that had once been ignored. It also amplified division. Facts fractured. Information flooded without filter. The nation argued loudly, often past itself. Democracy became harder. Yet through pandemics, protests, elections, and unrest, the system endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was tested. Over and over. The American story has never been a straight line. It bends, it breaks, it repairs itself imperfectly. Each generation inherits both the promise and the burden. Liberty won at great cost, equality unfinished, responsibility unavoidable.
The United States was not born free. It fought for freedom, failed to fully deliver it, and continues to struggle toward it. That struggle, the refusal to stop questioning, resisting, and rebuilding, is the true inheritance of the nation. Not a flag, not a document, but an idea that survives only when people are willing to defend it, again and again.